He is the first son of a Canadian Prime Minister also to become a Canadian Prime Minister. He is the first ever federal leader to take his party from third place to a majority government. Tonight, we'll take a look at what Justin Trudeau's done with the first 100 days of his Liberal government with, in Calgary, Alberta, Martha Hall-Findlay, former Liberal MP, now Executive Fellow at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. In Washington, D.C., David Frum, Senior Editor of The Atlantic Magazine. Here in studio, Janice Stein, Founding Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at U of T, and Michael Dentant, political columnist at the National Post. And it's great to have you two here and our two guests in Points Beyond for our discussion today. Let's just sort of recap, if we can, a bit of what's happened in the first 100 days of Justin Trudeau's government. The Liberal Party, incidentally, made about 189 promises during the campaign. 19 have been kept so far. For example, appointing a gender-balanced cabinet, the return of the long-form census, the withdrawal of Canada's CF-18s from the fight against ISIS, 25,000 Syrian refugees have come to Canada, although a little later than promised, and the middle-class tax cut and the tax hike on the richest Canadians did go into effect January 1st, although the price tag for that was higher than promised by about $100 million. Martha Hall-Findlay, want to start with you first. You ran against Justin Trudeau, some may remember, for the leadership of the Liberal Party. And in one of your speeches during that campaign, you asked, what happened to the Liberal Party we once knew, the one of bold and brave ideas? And I want to know whether you think that party is back now that Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister.
I'm hoping so. When I talk about bold and good ideas, it's not just how you do things, but also some of the longer-term questions that are facing the country. So first off, if you compare what we've had for the last number of years, the attitude is fantastic. And yes, I know we'll have lots of chance to talk about how there's a whole lot more to this than attitude, but there's an awful lot to attitude as well. And I am all for the positive, you know, this attitude of what can we do as opposed to where we can pinch, where can we pull back. So one, that's fantastic. Whether it's new or not, I don't think so. But it's nice to see because of what we didn't have a lot of that in the last little while. This effort at transparency is terrific. You know, things like putting the cabinet minister mandate letters out in the public, I think, is terrific. The communication with the rest of the country, there was really a them and us thing happening in the last few years between the federal government and a number of the provincial governments and municipal governments. And to full credit to the Prime Minister and the ministers, there's been an awful lot of work out across the country. It's not just, talking, it's listening. There's a lot of give and take. And I think that bodes really well for the rest of the time. We'll have a chance to talk about some of the more difficult questions and challenges facing the government. But for me, it's a very good start.
Okay. David Frum, the Prime Minister is going to be coming to your city in, I guess not too long from now, a week and a half or so from now, for an official visit and a state dinner. For those who do pay any attention to Canada in the American capital, how is he perceived so far?
He has not made a huge impression here in Washington. He is, I think, from the American point of view, look, if Canada, so long as Canada avoids major mistakes, Canada doesn't get a lot of attention. Canada's on the verge, however, of making some major mistakes that will capture attention. One of the things as I watch this government from a distance, there's a story that Karen Hughes, my former White House colleague, tells in her memoir, walking along the beach in Galveston on a holiday and seeing a plane pulling behind her an advertising flyer that said something like, "Jill, come back, I am miserable without you, Jack." And she thought, bad message, Jack. Too much about you, not enough about her. This is a government that is run by and for professional residents of Ottawa. Its idea of change is internal. It's what the NGOs and the civil servants and the lobbyists want. Meanwhile, Canada is heading toward the most extreme economic crisis since the early 1990s. And the government seems not only to have no plan as to how to cope with this, but not even to be aware that their little raft is heading toward the waterfall. They're busy taking selfies with refugees while Canada is heading toward a crisis because of this Chinese-led commodity price collapse that is upending Brazil, upending Australia, and is already upended the province of Alberta and will reach across the rest of the Canadian economy as well.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, David, because you said we're on the verge of making major mistakes. Could you give me a short list?
Well, the single biggest mistake is summed up by that extraordinarily foolish thing that Justin Trudeau said at Davos, where he said, in the past, Canada was known for its resources under my predecessor, because that was, I thought, that was inappropriate as well as foolish. Under my predecessor, Canada was known for its resources. I would like to be known for resourcefulness. As if the rocks and as if resources produce themselves without human knowledge. But Canada has always been, and will be for a long time to come, a substantially resource-based economy. The prices of Canada's resources are collapsing in global markets, and that upends all the rest of the way the Canadian economy works. And the Liberal government has an idea that, well, this will sort itself out because as the resources decline, so does the value of the Canadian dollar, and that will allow for a Canadian manufacturing export boom as it did in the 1990s, not understanding that because of the global supply chains, because the inputs are produced globally, you don't get the kind of pop from a decline in your currency that you did a quarter century ago today. So Ontario and Quebec are not going to see the advantage that was once seen as the western part of the country and the eastern part of the country move into a global commodity deflation.
Michael, you obviously keep an eye on what this government's doing from your perch at the National Post, and I wonder whether so far, admittedly, 100-plus days in, whether the Prime Minister seems to be keeping faith with or living up to the hopes of those who invested hopes in him.
I think he's trying to. I think the team around him are trying very hard, sometimes to a fault, actually, to fulfill the promises, to keep the promises they made in the campaign. I suspect they'd be making decisions more quickly if they weren't trying quite so hard to fulfill every promise rather than adjusting based on current circumstances, as governments always inevitably do. For example, the decision which is, I think, caused them the most problems so far, the decision to withdraw the CF-18s from the war against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They took a great deal of time to make that decision. They have been hammered by all sides for the length of time they've taken, and the ultimate decision they've taken, in my opinion, is wrong. Whether or not you agree with it or not, the long delay in making it caused them to sustain far more political damage than they would have had they either changed their stance after the Paris attacks last fall or announced what they were going to do last year, which I suspect they could have done, given that the mission, the new mission that they've announced, you know, it's in some ways more ambitious than the other one, than the Harper government's mission, but it's not something that, based on what I see anyway, they couldn't have announced a couple of months ago.
Well, fortunately, we have somebody who's been watching foreign affairs in this country and around the world for 50 years sitting right beside you. So I'm going to ask her, did this government take too long to figure out how it wanted to or whether it wanted to implement its campaign promise on ISIS?
Well, first of all, there was no question they were going to implement the campaign promise. That was a given from day one.
Michael seems to think it took too long for them to implement it.
Well, that's a separate issue, right? But so the first one, I'm absolutely surprised that everybody who's so stunned that a government keeps its election promises. You know, we would have if they hadn't, we'd have a whole bunch of people screaming, no accountability, no accountability.
I think I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I think the issue is
the length of time to make the decision.
The length of time and a not well thought through promise made in the heat of a campaign in the first place, which upon further review might have been stood down.
That criticism, which Michael is not alone at making, is actually based on two things. Let's deal with the length of time issue first. Actually, the reason it took that much time is the government was consulting in Ottawa, across all the departments. They did not only consult DND, they consulted, this genuinely was a whole of government approach. They consulted all the departments, and the chief of the defense staff went back 4 or 5 times with increasingly refined proposals. So yes, it took time. I'm not convinced there's huge political damage externally. If you actually look at allied responses to it, you're not getting a lot of criticism. And the final point, I understand that there are Canadians who are upset that our 6 aircraft are not participating in the coalition fight. But again, from a global perspective, there are over 200 coalition aircraft participating in the strike. You're right, this is a more ambitious agenda. Where it's arguable, we may in fact make a difference, Steve. So it's hard for me to understand the heat around this issue
Michael's
in the
gonna tell you.
country.
I was just going to say that the issue, the political issue here, and the reason why they've sustained so much damage is that neither the defense minister or the prime minister or any member of the government is able to articulate the logical reason why there's a difference between bombing with CF-18s and supporting the bombing of other coalition allies with refueling, resupply, spy planes, and so forth. It's a logical inconsistency in their argument that, given all the time it's taken to come up with this strategy, one would have thought they would have been able to imagine that criticism and come up with a satisfactory response, which they have not done.
Again, it was a campaign promise. It was made in the heat of an election campaign where an opposition party trying to differentiate itself from the government. So to develop some elaborate strategic response to frame a campaign promise, it's arguable whether there's really an advantage to do that. I think the right question is, and I think you got there, is do we have a coherent mission, and is the contribution that we're making valued by our allies?
What's the answer to those two
Yes.
questions? You think yes and yes?
Yes.
Let me go to David from in Washington on that. When the Prime Minister made good on his commitment made during the campaign to withdraw the 6 jets from participating in the ISIS attacks, did that make any ripples in Washington at all, to your knowledge?
Yeah, well, Canada has been disinvited from some conferences on the ISIS problem that it used to be a fuller participant in. I think what Michael and Janice are trying to get at, the reason that the implementation took so long was when you don't think before you talk, you have to do a lot more thinking after you talk. So because this commitment about the CF-18s was issued, as Janice said, for crassly political reasons, then you inherit the responsibilities of government and alliance obligations.
I don't think she quite said that. I don't think she quite said that.
Just for the record.
And the immediate tactical necessity to pose as a neutralist power now translates into, well, wait a minute, Canada actually is part of this global alliance, and what does it do? And so the amazing irony of all of the government's commitment is that they have now found themselves actually undertaking a mission that is much more dangerous and much more likely to result in Canadian casualties than the mission they had before.
Martha Hulk Finley, can I get you to weigh in on this?
Well, I've actually been listening to everyone else. When you look at what the efforts are in terms of foreign affairs generally, I look at the efforts, the renewed enthusiasm for the UN, for example, and the fact that this Ban Ki-moon was in Toronto or in Ottawa visiting with the Prime Minister and saying such glowing things. We're so glad to see Canada back. I would just urge the new government a bit of caution and a bit of pragmatism. This is not the world of Lester Pearson anymore. An awful lot has changed. And I, for one, think that the world is better with multilateral organizations like the United Nations, but it needs some desperate fixing. So my view of that would be great that the current government wants to be back involved with the United Nations, but let's look at it as where can we help to make it better to actually reflect the new century.
Janice?
At the risk of offending some of my fellow Canadians, let me say that Ban Ki-moon is among the worst Secretary Generals that the UN has ever had.
He just died. Let's not speak ill of the dead.
Well,
Okay.
no. Boutros Ghali.
Oh, excuse me.
But Ban Ki-moon is still alive.
I got
last time
completely
I
confused there. Sorry.
But he was been a truly mediocre Secretary General. It was the. And that's partly because the UN chooses by the lowest common denominator. So I'm actually sorry that he's led off the parade of foreign dignitaries that have come to Canada for the new government. I don't think that's leading with strength, but it probably was not their choice because he was invited to give a speech at a sister university. Circling back to David's point, let me just again correct for the record, the government has never said that it's neutral. It is clearly said as a member of the coalition, and it is looking for an opportunity to contribute effectively to that coalition. Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, has welcomed the contribution. And it's actually worth stopping for a minute and looking at that contribution, Steve, because it's in many ways a controversial decision. It continues the Harper government's support of the Kurds in the north. And that's both, particularly in Iraq, not in Syria, but in Iraq. And there's no question that the Kurds are now poised in a way that they have not been for the last 100 years to take advantage of the chaos and create an increasingly autonomous zone both in Iraq and Syria. That's a deeply political decision, which I'm not convinced that anybody in this country has really fully understood as we move down this road.
I think Michael Dentat has fully understood it, because you wrote something that when I saw it, my earbrows went up, and I really wanted to ask you about this. You wrote, Trudeau is now a wartime leader who leads a wartime cabinet. And my question is, really?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the same way that Paul Martin became a wartime leader in 2005 when he and Rick Hillier planned and then implemented and led the expanded Canadian mission in Afghanistan.
They had
in other
thousands
words,
of troops over there.
They had 2,600 in February of 2006, and we're nowhere near that now. They simply tripled the ground contingent of special forces from, I think, 69 to 206. So it's very small. But the reason I said that is because when you're a prime minister and you send additional troops on the ground, we're in situations where, as David quite rightly points out, they're facing far more danger than the pilots of those CF-18s were facing. There are accidents that can happen. There's friendly fire that can happen, as we saw. The first casualty that we had that Canada has had in this engagement was due to friendly fire, and so I don't think that they've reconciled themselves to this role. I don't think that it's a role they would have chosen to have taken on, but it is one that has been thrust upon them.
Let me get David Frum's take on this. Trudeau is now a wartime leader who leads a wartime cabinet. David, is that your understanding of where things are at?
Well, Canada's undertaken larger military responsibilities, but Justin Trudeau is none of those things. Look, the essence of this government is, Janice rightly said, Canada's not neutral, can't be neutral. But this government, which was so political, that that wanted to pick up some votes from people who leaned in a more neutralist direction. They wanted to appease certain anti-Harper constituencies, and so they made a series of commitments. And many of them impossible or foolish, and some of them correctly rolled back. But the biggest problem with the government is their commitments are at variance with the actual situation of the country. I mean, this remains, as this discussion is, a deeply inside Ottawa for its own purposes, government and discussion. And the budget, the budgetary promises and the tax promises they've made, again, seem to have no awareness at all of what is happening to Canada in the world economy. And so what I am mostly struck by is, it conjures up, Michael's right about the situation, the military situation, but it conjures up an implication of seriousness of purpose that is clearly not there. This is an utterly tactical government, as yet not yet feeling what it is going to intensely feel in 6 months, the consequences of global commodity price deflation. That is going to be a huge event for Canada. And meanwhile, they're busy thinking, how can we rearrange the voting system to get ourselves more advantage next time? And how can we tinker with this? How can we get partisan senators whom we will call nonpartisan Ottawa things in the face of a gathering economic storm?
Okay, we should say, in the interest of full disclosure, your sister currently sits as a senator in the Senate of Canada. And we just put that out there.
She does an outstanding one.
Okay.
To come back to the economic issues that David's put on the table, I don't think there's any doubt that Canada faces a huge challenge from dropping commodity prices. But part of the reason we face such a huge challenge is the last Prime Minister sold us to the world as an energy superpower, did not diversify our economy, and did not create a broad enough platform so when commodities drop, as they always do, what goes up goes down, Canada does not have the resilience in the economy that we should have had. So if you look at I can't agree, David, entirely with your argument here, because if you look at the message of this government, it is, we need to develop our capacity to innovate. We need to develop high value added exports. We need to insert ourselves into global supply chains so that we're not wholly dependent on commodities and commodity prices if this country is to have the kind of economic future that we've had in the past. That's a very difficult argument to refute.
Let me get Martha Hall Finley on this, because hang on,
it would have been helpful then to arrive in office with some policies. Those are speeches. By the way, it's completely wrong to suggest that it was because of Stephen Harper that Canada, when the world is offering you $107 a barrel for your oil sands, you sell. You get the money while you can. Of course you do. It would be irresponsible not to. When something is valuable, you get the price. And Canada made hay while the sun shone. This new party says, okay, Canada's over-reliant on natural resources. I don't think that's a very sensible thing to say, but that's their view. So what is our policy? Our policy is to point out how unfortunate it is that Canada is so reliant on natural resources. But meanwhile, they're a majority government that has had a lot of time to prepare, and they've arrived in office with no ideas about how to deal with this problem, except the familiar write a check to Bombardier. That's a strategic investment.
Well, I do have to hear from Martha Hall. Yeah, go ahead, Martha.
And this whole sort of somehow resources bad, anything else good makes absolutely no sense to me. I mean, the number of countries around the world that would just do anything to be blessed with the resources that we have, let's not forget. That includes fish, that includes wood, that includes minerals, it includes energy, it includes wheat, it includes canola, it includes beef, it includes all sorts of things. And it also includes the incredible technological innovations that we have managed to build up in extracting and in growing and in producing those resources. So to somehow say, resources are bad and we should diversify. One, if you look at Norway, and the success of Norway in dealing with one resource being energy, when Michael says we made hay while the sun shone, actually we didn't make hay well enough while the sun shone, and I think Alberta is certainly feeling that. But the whole country, when we have good times, taking advantage of the things that we have in this country, resources being a significant part of that, we should manage those times better. That doesn't mean that the current government can just, waltz in and say, we need to innovate. It doesn't just happen like that. So one of the things that I actually, despite my enthusiasm earlier, Steve, tempered a little bit by some cautions, because I'm hearing an awful lot of, we're going to put money over here, we're going to put money over here, we'll run deficits for a while, but now we know they're going to be bigger than what we thought, we'll invest in infrastructure. The last government did that too. This government has to remember that it's going to have to come from somewhere. It's a lot easier to spend than it is to pull back. And I'm worried when I hear some things like tough political decisions of the last government, moving the old age security age, for example, from 65 to 67, which the rest of the world is battling with the aging demographic challenge. To hear our guys say, well, we made a campaign promise, so we're going to drop it back down to 65. Just exercise some caution, because remember when Jean Chrétien said he was, during a campaign, would reverse the GST. Not reversing it was one of the best decisions he ever made, and in fact was fundamental to one of the things he's been given most credit for, and that is over the 90s and early 2000s, cutting back the deficits, paying down the debt. Not fulfilling that particular campaign promise was a pretty critical one. So I just, on the economic side, sunny ways are great, but this government's going to have to manage things and make some pretty tough decisions.
Michael.
Agree with everything Martha said just now. To David's point, a couple of things. One, it's neither fair nor true to suggest that the Trudeau team, which includes obviously himself and his closest advisors, didn't consider the economy when they were crafting their campaign, when they were crafting their policy. In fact, I know that they spent the better part of a couple of years crafting their tax policy, which had a political purpose, which is essentially to take the quote-unquote ordinary person vote away from the Harper Conservatives, which they'd skillfully appropriated between 2004 and 2011. But it had a larger purpose than that, which was to deal precisely with the economic problems that are facing us now. In other words, the fact that there was this extreme reliance in the Canadian economy on the oil patch, and to maybe only a slightly lesser extent on northern resources and mining. Trudeau's people have been aware for years that this is a problem, and they designed their tax policy to address it. I think the struggle they're having right now is that it's a bigger problem than you can solve with a federal policy. And I think they're grappling with that now, and they're going to have trouble dealing with that now. The strategy that would have worked before the price of oil collapse would have been to somehow link the traditional manufacturing economy in Ontario and Quebec and the East more closely into the oil patch economy, into the supply chain, and into the northern resource economy, perhaps processing. Obviously, pipelines would have been a big part of that. All of that has now been thrown into question by the collapse in the price of crude. I suspect that's part of why it's taking them a while to develop economic policy and why it's taken them a while to come up with the first budget.
But David, let me follow up with you on this angle in particular. You know, a lot of us up here watch the American talk shows. You're on them a lot. I see you on those programs. We're watching the American presidential races with, I think, Janice says with horror, let's just say with increasing fascination. One of the things that we hear up here is that many Americans point to Justin Trudeau and say, look, he's running deficits and he just won a majority government. Let's not get spooked about deficit financing because the economy needs it right now. Are you hearing that too?
Not so much, but if to the extent, and we can bracket for a minute how wise it is for him to be running deficits for the purposes he wants to run them. This goes to the question of, did the previous government use the good times properly? What they did was to use the good times to put Canada on a sound fiscal footing, despite the crisis of 2008, 2009, the worst crisis since the 1930s. That they left their successors with the ability to borrow. Which is something that Canadian governments have not always left their successors with. So they have the power to borrow. Now let's see if they use that wisely. But the question is, what do you borrow for? If you're borrowing to finance current consumption, if you're borrowing, as Martha says, in order to bring down the retirement age after having so painfully raised it, that's not very wise borrowing. If you have plans to borrow, let's hear them. But as Michael said, I mean, it's been obvious forever. We've all known commodity prices go up and they go down. If your economic philosophy is you want to see a less commodity-reliant Canada, you've been out of power for a decade, there's a lot of time to think about what you do. This should not be such a brain teaser at the 100-day mark. You should arrive ready to go. This government arrived, this team arrived ready for good times. They're a good time government. They're not, and that's, I think, why I bristled a little bit at the phrase wartime government. They're a good time government, and they have good time policies, and they are now moving into bad times, and they are unready. And they have a good time style, and they have good time preoccupations. They are preoccupied with changing the voting system, fooling around with the internal workings of the government, giving $15 million to this UN agency to buy a day's good press, doing a favor for that NGO to buy another day's good press. And
David,
meanwhile, this crisis is
really
at hand.
Unfair. Having sat at that table a number of years ago, because this has been a number of years in the making, there were, for example, an awful lot of discussions about when you should invest in infrastructure, what kind of infrastructure the country needs. We know that we have a significant infrastructure deficit. We talked a lot about what you should invest in, when you need to invest. You need to invest in infrastructure that will help, in fact, productivity, that will help, in fact, those other economic drivers that you want to see. This was not made up last week. So I think you're being a little bit unfair to the work that has gone in to get to where this government is.
Hang on, David. Let David come back.
Okay, but Martha makes a very powerful point, and I have great respect for your point of view on this, and I know you think very hard about these issues. But Canada's biggest, most fundamental economic problem is a persistent lag in productivity behind the United States. And one of the greatest mysteries in Canadian economic policy is, why is that so? The free trade agreement was supposed to have closed that gap, and it did a little bit, but not nearly as much as those of us who advocated free trade in the 1980s had hoped it would. So why is the gap there? Now, you can posit that it's because of infrastructure. But that's just an assumption. It's something that needs to be investigated. They posited that infrastructure is the reason because that yielded the answer they wanted to get. But it's not necessarily true. And they didn't think hard. They thought too much about what would we like to be true, not enough about what is true. Not enough about what is the reason for this overwhelming economic problem that is now going to be so urgent because the commodities aren't there to pay for everything else?
So, David, just on these points, first of all, there have been analyses done both inside the government and by independent agencies like the Conference Board, which actually put the number on the deferred deficit, maintenance deficit that we have on public infrastructure. You just look at the bridges in Montreal, the transportation bottlenecks that we have in Toronto and in our other big cities, and we have a large and accumulated deficit in urban infrastructure in this country. And the estimate of the price tag in Toronto, which I happen to have seen recently, is $1 billion in lost productivity because of traffic jams in this city. So I don't think there's any question that really the issue going forward for the Trudeau government.
That's not responsive at all.
Well, the issue for the Trudeau government going forward is, do we invest in shovel-ready projects, which is the temptation, and one which the Harper government actually did at the height of a recession, or do we invest in infrastructure, which is going to grow our capacity to export, increase our productivity, and allow Canadian firms to move up the value chain into global supply chains in the economy? That's a very fair question. It's a hard one, and it's one that the past government thought about and that this government is thinking about in a very serious way.
David, come on back in.
You went way too fast there. You stole a base. It's true that if you ask cities, give us a list of projects, they'll give you a list of projects. And if you want to assert that the reason for Canada's productivity problems is because of those projects, you can assert it. But these are actually investigatable questions. Is it true, for example, governments have limited resources and limited time. Is it true that infrastructure is a bigger problem for Canadian productivity than, say, interprovincial trade barriers? That's knowable. Now, if infrastructure is the answer, that's great. You can spend money.
My point was that if you're going to invest in infrastructure, an awful lot of work has been done over the last number of years to determine which items of infrastructure make the most sense. David, no one said that infrastructure was going to solve our productivity problem in and of itself.
I would also note
that the point is they're doing they're doing things for internal reasons, not to respond. They're doing things for their own internal constituency reasons, not to respond to Canada's actual needs.
Yeah, how do you know that?
The Harper government in 2008, 2009, in response to the Great Recession, rolled out what? A huge infrastructure spending plan that involved the building of arenas, the building of YMCAs, all across the country. And the Liberal plan, I happen to think, is too generous. They're planning to spend too much money on things that are undefinable, at least that are undefined now. For example, social infrastructure, green infrastructure. What is that? What does it look like? We don't know. That makes me very uncomfortable as a fiscal conservative. On the other hand, to be fair, the debt to GDP ratio right now in this country is just above 30%. In the mid-90s, when Paul Martin, as finance minister, instituted the greatest series of spending cuts of modern times in order to get the deficit under control and the debt under control, the debt to GDP ratio was close to 70%. So we're not in the same situation now that we were then, which means that a series of small deficits, small quote unquote, of $10 billion, which is what they promised in the campaign, is really on an economy the size of Canada's a rounding error. It's more symbolic than real. If we get into a situation where they're spending 40, 50 billion, 60 billion more than they're taking in, then I can see it becoming a real problem. I suppose it's really difficult to judge right now because we don't yet know where they're going to be. Trudeau has said 10 billion is not going to do it. He hasn't said exactly how high he's going to go.
But I think no matter what the actual number is, they have to spend it wisely. And I agree. There's some big questions. I couldn't agree more, actually. But back into the point, I think the number is less for us to get to hang our hat on right now for all the reasons that Michael just said. But we do need to hold this government to account to their promise, if you will, but also the general thrust of the infrastructure idea is that it's not just to put money into the economy, it's not just to build arenas. We want to make sure that the infrastructure actually does longer-term good as far as our economic prospects.
Martha, let me follow up while you've got the floor, and that is a couple of weeks ago, Justin Trudeau came out to Alberta. We know that he has made Alberta, he's really put the focus on there, understanding that it was his father who essentially alienated Alberta 5 decades ago, and that ever since then, the Liberal Party has been trying to, work its way back into the hearts of Albertans. What impression did he leave with when he went out to Alberta and listened?
Generally very positive for the very reason I said at the beginning of the show. It's an awful lot better to have people getting together and actually talking through some of the challenges than it is to have a them and us and we're not even going to meet together. So right off the bat, that's a very positive step for the Prime Minister to take. I think at least as important has been the number of ministers that have been in Alberta and British Columbia and points east and west across the country. That's also very important. I will, again, though, a note of caution. When the Minister of Natural Resources was here a week or so ago, Jim Carr, he was in a question and answer, saying a lot of the right things. We need to get our energy to tidewater. We need to do it sustainably, but we get it. We need to get our energy to tidewater. But then when he was asked, well, you're talking about adding improvements, if you will, to the regulatory process, improvements to how the NEB, the National Energy Board, works. I think everybody's okay with that. We all understand where that has come from. But then he was asked point blank, well, once you do actually have a new and improved regulatory process, are you then going to commit to abide by those decisions? And he said, well, the whole thing is political. This is actually almost a quote. The process is political. And once that regulatory decision gets made or those regulatory decisions are made, then and only then will Cabinet then undertake its own consultations to determine whether to go ahead or not.
Okay.
I can tell you that's a really big problem because both domestic and international investors need to know the rules of the game. They need to have a sense of engagement. In Quebec right now, they're having real problems because a company that was contracted to, a company called Petrolia that was contracted to explore some opportunities on Anticosti Island. Now I'm mixing up my French now. The Premier of Quebec, Couillard, is now going completely backwards on that. It is really important. I'll say it again, and I'll say it a lot of times whenever given the opportunity. Both domestic and international investors need certainty. They need to have some sense of what the rules of the game are, and they need to know that the people who are involved are also going to abide by the rules.
I think I read that in one of our daily newspapers today in an op-ed penned by Martha Hall Finley herself.
But she's absolutely right, Steve.
Okay, let's do this. We've got about 5-6 minutes to go here, and I do look at the Prime Minister is very popular right now. Anybody can read polls, and his numbers are, I don't want to say through the roof, but they're pretty darn good right now. They are strong. Janice, let me start with you. Since we all know honeymoons don't last,
They don't.
What pitfalls lying ahead should the PM be most aware of today?
I think the big one is the economy. These are true. I mean, we're all for saying that wherever we come down. Any Canadian who looks out understands there are big headwinds coming our way. The downturn in the Chinese economy is not short. It's structural. They are going through a transition. And it's really difficult, Steve, to imagine that we're going to see a commodities boom of the kind that we saw over this last decade, which really means there's structural adjustment coming to the Canadian economy. And any government is going to be judged on, does it lead this country through this structural adjustment to build better, stronger platforms for future growth?
Michael Denton.
He needs to get results on pipelines, and he needs to get them soon, I think.
Well, he's put a new process in place. What are your hopes for that?
He's put a new process in place, but he hasn't yet said, I think Energy East is a good idea, for example. And I think he should say that. I think all the ministers should be saying that. They should be unequivocal about it. They should say that pipelines are a better way of transporting oil than by train. They should say that whether it's by train or by pipeline, the oil is going to come out of the ground. As the State Department found when they were analyzing Keystone XL, they found that the difference in terms of climate change effects would be negligible. They should be saying those things. They should say, yes, we need a rigorous environmental approach, but let there be no mistake, we need to do this. And they're not saying that yet. And the reason why I think we're in the situation we're in now partly is because the Harper government never really said it either. They didn't lead, I think, out of an excess of a desire not to be perceived as being too bullish on pipelines, although they did put some legislation in place, but Harper never really made speeches extolling the virtues of pipelines. And I think Trudeau could step up and do that now, and I think he needs to do that.
You know that if he did that, every environmentalist in this country, starting with David Suzuki and going all the way down to whomever, would come crashing down on his head.
He's the Prime Minister of the whole country.
Needs to show leadership.
He's the Prime Minister of the whole country, not just the people who elected him, not just the environmentalists, not just diehard Liberals or New Democrats. He has to try to govern for everybody, and that is what his re-election hopes are going to rest on.
Let's get David Frum.
And you can't have ideas of bailing out the auto sector, which primarily benefited Ontario and Quebec, have talks about bailing out Bombardier, which would primarily benefit Quebec, and not even have a government that's going to stand up to a regulatory process that allows the pipelines to be built. I mean, that's a heck of a lot better than handing over money. Would be actually to have some political leadership to get some of this infrastructure built.
David Frum, in your view, what's the first thing that could derail this honeymoon?
It's already in the process of being derailed, and that is his priorities are not those of the Canadian people. His priorities, the first things he wanted to do, were symbolic: refugees, changing the voting system in his favor as Canadian economy headed and the Alberta economy headed into crisis. He is going to degrade Canada's balance sheet, which it may be a justifiable decision if you buy the right things. He's going to buy the wrong things in order to appease constituencies. He's not focused on what are the long-term problems in the Canadian economy. He's focused on delivering for interest groups that support him. And he will have, as all Liberal governments do, he will have problems of ethics. I think that there are a lot of people looking at the pending legalization of marijuana as a lobbying opportunity. We've already seen the line forming around the door. Can they deliver honest government? Because they are such an interest group coalition, it's very difficult for them. So I think that, but the core problem is what he wants to do is about certain very narrow constituencies based in Ottawa at a time when Canada is heading into some very difficult days.
Last minute to Janice.
You know, on pipelines, which I think everybody would say is an issue for this country. Look, the previous government didn't deliver one, as you just said, Michael, and we paid a huge premium because we haven't been able to get our oil to market. Our best chance, our best shot at getting a pipeline is if we give the government time to build what Jim Prentice called the social license. So I think everybody has to understand here that we have to build a coalition in this country that's broad enough so we can actually get a pipeline through a regulatory process. That's a fine dance. This government has no choice but to try to do it, but it's not going to be quick, and you're not going to get the answer that the three of you are talking about in the timeline that you expect.
Okay, speaking of timeline, that's our time, and I want to thank everybody. We will pass these comments along to the PMO and make sure that they get your advice. Meantime, the host will go back and try and differentiate his Ban Ki-moons from his Boutros galleys. That's for another program. Martha Hall-Finley and David Frum, it's great to have you on the line from Calgary and Washington, D.C. Janice Stein, Michael Dentant here in our studio in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks so
Great
much.
to be here. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.